Welcome to the last SSP Wednesday seminar of this academic year. We will reconvene sometime probably mid-September, both physically in our temporary space and virtually where we always are on the YouTube homepage. So I'm really pleased today to be able to welcome Alexander Downs to SSP. He's a professor at George Washington University and has been luxuriating in Hanover, New Hampshire on a year-long sabbatical with our dear friends at the Dickey Institute. I say luxuriating in jest because he's been working on a new project, and I learned just a moment ago that this is the first time he's sort of presented it to a large audience.
Nope.
So be nice, everybody. When and why?
Pretend my parents are in the room.
The United States promotes democracy or dictatorship. Alex is well known to many of us.
The Q&A is later.
Yes.
I don't want to get deported, so we're not going to ask that question.
So he is co-director of the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies at GW. His book, Targeting Civilians at War, was published by Cornell in 2008 and won the Joseph Lepgold Prize awarded by Georgetown University for the best book, International Relations, published in that year. And it was based upon his dissertation, which won the Helen Dwight Reed Award. His second book, Catastrophic Success, Why Foreign Imposed Regime Change Goes Wrong, was published also by Cornell in 2021. And he's written on a variety of other subjects, including civilian victimization, foreign imposed regime change, military effectiveness, democracy coercion, alliances and solutions to civil wars. There's much more that I could say about him, but I'm eager to hear about his new project. And so please join me in welcoming Alex.
Thank you very much for coming. I know it's a busy time of year. And I'm very flattered and humbled to be here today. I also come before you also humble in the sense that, as Taylor said, this is a new project for me. I've been working on it this year when I haven't been plucking ticks off the dog. And so I have a lot of more questions than I have answers at this point. So I want to be a bit of a sponge here today, sort of tell you, sort of stuff about how far I've gotten, and then hopefully hear your thoughts on the matter. Okay, without further ado. So the question I'm asking in this project is, why does the United States, and I'm open to other democracies, but right now, for simplicity, focusing on the United States, why do they sometimes support and promote democracy, whereas other times they support and promote dictatorships? So on the plus side, right, US presidents repeat like a mantra that we promote democracy. It's a big goal of our foreign policy. The United States has also spent significant blood and treasure to promote democracy and defeat dictatorship over the years. Places like Germany and Japan, places like Afghanistan and Iraq less successfully. But the US has also expended more treasure than blood to defeat democracies in some cases and install or support dictatorships. So two of the top 5 recipients of US foreign aid since World War II have been dictatorships. That's Egypt and South Vietnam. The other 3 also have their issues, Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel. The United States has toppled numerous elected regimes over time and supported countless murderous dictators. To name off a few, Suharto in Indonesia, killed only 500,000 people in 1965. Yahya Khan in Pakistan, 1971. General Rios Montt in Guatemala got an audience at the White House with Ronald Reagan. So there's a lot of sort of literature on this. It's a big question. I just want to highlight, I can talk about those in a bit, just highlight for you one that's prominent right now. John Owen's book on, which I can never remember the title of, The Clash of Ideas. Yeah, there we go, In Great Power Politics. It's a great book. It's about transnational ideological competition and promotion of your own regime And he argues that in times of these big competition, countries will promote their own regime type. And yet, right, we know that the US often has done precisely the opposite in that case. And Owen himself, I love John Owen, don't get me wrong, made precisely the opposite argument a few years later. I'll go into that a bit later. So why does this matter? To be glib, Donald Trump, right? A bit of contemporary relevance right now, as he has come to power with a very different attitude towards democracy in the world. Just quickly spin through a few of the more serious implications, right, for US foreign policy orientation or alliances, US interventions, for the liberal international order, democratic peace theory, and democratic backsliding. So, for US foreign policy administration orientation, going forward, right? Trump has come into office. He's got a bromance with Vladimir Putin. He has an on and off bromance with Kim Jong-un, Viktor Orban, right? So he's come to power, with a very different approach and who he wants to associate with, support, etc. Interventions, right? We all saw this, where the Biden administration and NATO were strong supporters of Ukraine. Trump came into office with a different attitude. He's going to end the conflict on day one, froze aid to the Ukrainians, scolded Zelensky in the Oval Office. They've since walked that back a little bit, but are still sort of trying to impose sort of a more pro-Russian, favorable to Russia settlement. For the much, what's the word, battered liberal international order, Trump is, working hard, I think, to dismantle the order if it wasn't dead already, not only with being friendly with dictators, but with tariffs against democratic allies. It's not have direct implications for democratic peace theory, but the United States has knocked off a number of democracies over the years. And if certainly kind of a puzzle for democratic peace theory, why the United States would be so buddy-buddy and have very good peaceful relations with autocracies. And then for democratic backsliding, right? If the United States is no longer, promoting democracy abroad and buddying up to dictators and democratic backsliders elsewhere, not to mention what might be going on in this country, then, that's only going to encourage that trend to go even further. So, insert proto-embryonic, whatever, very provisional arguments here. Just a quick summary. In general, it's kind of a two-step argument. One, I'm going to argue that the key factors are economic power and military power, right? And that the US is going to promote democracy more in places that are powerful and threatening. If rarely, right? War is the opportunity. If you have the opportunity, and this is because this is where democratic peace theory really kicks in, leaders start to talk about this is the autocracy is the source of threat. So we need to make over these countries to eliminate that source of threat. Whereas on the other hand, weaker states, poorer states, that imperative is much weaker. And so just in terms of threat, dictatorship promotion will be more likely in weaker states. And of course, the threat from these states is indirect, right? It's more their possible association with powerful states, right? That could be the problem. Now, however, we know that the United States has promoted democracy in weaker states. So within that category, there's a few things that I'm going to emphasize. One is if the threat goes away, that could potentially make that minor state a threat. Democracy is no longer dangerous, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, and therefore promoting democracy becomes much easier. If the dictatorial ally is taking actions that make the probability of it becoming a threat, like I say, a revolution against it, more likely. That could spur democracy promotion. And then, of course, if the United States expects the resulting country to have congruent interests, it's more likely to promote democracy as well. So that's sort of where I'm going to go. How I'm going to get there, I'm going to take a page out of my friend Caitlin Talmadge's book and sharpen the puzzle. This is one of my favorite things that Caitlin does in her work. And I'm going to outline some existing explanations. Not all of them, although if you have questions about the others, I'll have them listed and we can talk about them later. Elaborate a little bit on my embryonic theory, and then say, research design? What's that? Okay, just to sharpen the puzzle, right? Just go over this a little bit more, right? Almost all US presidents are out there saying things about democracy promotion. Whether it's Woodrow Wilson making the world safe for democracy, to George W. Bush's second inaugural, I could put Obama up there, you could put Joe Biden up there, right? Everybody likes to say this. And they've actually done things about it, right? I heard a bunch of you went to Normandy recently and saw, firsthand where US troops stormed ashore to try and overthrow Adolf Hitler's regime, but also more recently, Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, on the other hand, the United States has done the opposite quite a lot. So let's think about our life's choices, right? This man, nobody knows his name, and I can't even remember, which is why I wrote it down, Luigi Facta. He has a great mustache. His claim to fame is he was the last prime minister in Italy before Mussolini. And the United States, after Mussolini seized power, was very happy about Mussolini. They thought, this guy, law and order, he's good for us. And besides, those Italians, they need a firm hand, right? They're hot-blooded. Seriously, I'm not making this up, right? This was in, US diplomatic correspondence. Mohammad Mossadegh versus Mohammad Reza Shah in Iran in 1953. The United States helps to organize the ouster of Mossadegh in favor of the Shah. The next year in Guatemala, in 1954, Jacobo Arbenz, the sort of FDR of Central America, was trying to do things like land reform. And the United States' own diplomats described him as the FDR. Like, these are the kind of reforms he's doing. He's not some wild-eyed, Marxist. But the United States chose to replace him with Carlos Castillo Armas. Hitler mustache never goes out of style, apparently. In Congo, 1960, Patrice Lumumba. The United States actually thinks about poisoning him, sends poison to Larry Devlin in the Congo, and then, helps, assists, encourage Mobutu to take power. Chile, in 1964, the United States spends quite a bit of money to defeat Allende, and then again in 1970, but they fail. And then they try to get the Congress not to confirm him. They try to get generals to rise up, and eventually that happens in 1973. But this is not just a Cold War phenomenon. It's happening before the Cold War. It happens after. Okay, so back in the Arab Spring, Hosni Mubarak, who had been a long time US dictatorial client, Obama faces this, very terrible decision. What do I do with this guy? There's an uprising, Tahrir Square. Okay, we'll let him fall. We'll have elections. Oh, but somebody got elected that we don't like, who's not going to be with the program, play ball. So he ends up behind prison in favor of El-Sisi, and then Egypt back on the dole, right? So one of my favorite cases here that I'm kind of drawn to is the Dominican Republic. I figure Nisha Fazal had Dominican Republic case in her book. I can have one too, right? So, and it spans a great deal of time. So in the 1910s, the United States is overthrowing governments in the Dominican Republic. It's worried about German influence in the Dominican Republic. And then it occupies the place to try and straighten it out. And interestingly, it holds elections, even in a place where, as I'll show you a bit later, they've been quite not very flattering about the possibility of democracy there. A few years later, though, the government gets overthrown by the head of the Guardia Nacional. It's Rafael Trujillo, appointed by the US. And that whole institution, the National Guard, was created by the US to try and create some stability. He's a ally, client state of the United States for a good 30 years. But in 1961, the United States goes along with the assassination. In fact, they send some guns, not clear whether they were used, to assassinate Trujillo. And Kennedy says, no, 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 your son, your uncles, none of you are coming to power. They coerce them all to leave, and they help hold elections in which Juan Bosch wins. It's a sort of left-leaning social democrat type, not a wild-eyed Marxist. But he's overthrown in a few months by the military. And Kennedy's kind of miffed, but then he says, we're going to have to play ball with these guys. Okay. A few years later, Juan Bosch, there's another revolution that's happening. The forces are trying to overthrow the military and bring the democratically elected president of the Dominican Republic back to power. And we know what happens, right? LBJ sends the troops to prevent that from happening, and then holds sort of rigged elections to put their man back in power. So this is the kind of thing that I'm looking at. Now, I'm not saying I can explain all that at this point, hopefully someday, but this is the sort of variation that I'm talking about. Okay. What kind of work have people done to try and explain this over time? So there's sort of many out there. Some have been particularly applied to this question. Others you can sort of infer from the theories. And so I'll go through some of those, and then others, if you want to ask about them later, I'm happy to talk about. So some of you in the room might be old enough to remember this commercial. A lot of my students look at me and they're like, what are you talking about? Have you lost it, professor? Tastes great, less filling, right? So, right, Tony Smith's book, America's Mission, right? He proclaims in that book that democracy promotion is the central ambition of American foreign policy in the 20th century. So, very much like, and he goes through a lot of cases of the United States trying to build institutions in other countries and so forth. Now, on the other hand, historian David Schmitz is so exercised about this question that he wrote not one but two books, basically called the same thing, the United States and right-wing dictatorships, where he explicitly goes after this notion that the US is all about democracy promotion, and tells the tale of the US working with all these dictators. Now, in terms of explaining variation, like recognizing that sometimes one thing happens and another time other things happen, this is John Owen's argument from the greatest book cover of all time, The Clash of Ideas in World Politics. He's talking about foreign regime promotion. When do countries go abroad and promote their own institutions primarily? Or when do they promote institutions in another country? And his arguments about transnational ideological competition, it's kind of a mouthful, kind of like foreign imposed regime change, when sort of elites are sharply divided across countries or within countries, and that's when you're going to promote your own institutions because you see those countries as natural allies, and you almost always promote your own regime type. So as I mentioned, this explains some US behavior. Think about, just use the Cold War as an example of an ideological competition. The United States did do some democracy promotion in key places, but it did precisely the opposite in a lot of other places under the same conditions. And then after the Cold War, it sort of did the opposite again. It zigged in the other direction to promote democracy when there's no real ideological competition. It also, these are other minor things. It excludes kind of non-uses of force and cases that you have to promote institutions. You can't just change a leader. So it's leaving things out that maybe I want to try and get at. The opposite argument was made by Owen and a student of his at UVA, Michael Posnanski, back when he was a student of his, which was, when does the US drop dictators and instead promote democracy? And the argument they make is that the US drops dictators when there's no plausible alternative to the American model, i.e. capitalist liberal democracy. So in other words, the US supports dictators when there's transnational ideological competition and not when there isn't. Which, when I read this, I asked Posnanski recently at a thing at Dartmouth, I was like, am I reading this right? And I think I am reading it right. So this does explain quite a bit of behavior in the third world. We don't call it the third world anymore. But there's quite a bit of democracy promotion that goes on at this time, which you can't capture. And it doesn't, again, explain why you would support some dictators when there's after the Cold War, when it's safe not to do that. A third kind of argument looks at domestic politics. It's not about the sort of overarching systemic conditions. It's about congressional intervention. That the argument is that Congress is the sort of locus of caring about democracy, caring about human rights, and it's only when Congress gets exercised about things that it forces the executive to switch policies. So the argument by Mark Pisani in his book, Democracy at the Point of Bayonets, is that it's the sort of rise of the congressional committee system that empowers these kind of liberal internationalist types who care about things like promoting democracy and human rights. That is the cause of US shifting policies between democracy promotion and not. William Waldorf's book, Just Politics, makes a similar argument, but his key is really the activist groups outside of Congress that then pressure Congress people to take action to intervene. So, the sort of doubt I have about Pisani's work, which is really good, is that it breaks up the same intervention into periods of democracy promotion versus not. And there's some cases, for example, Haiti, where there's an extended period and he's saying, well, they promoted democracy from 1918 to 20 and 1923 to 26. Whereas my reading of the history is that it was a military dictatorship under the US for most of that time. Waldorf looks at a particular period in detail, the 1970s, and I think maybe some of the 80s, when the backlash against this, the Church Committee and so on, was at its height. But that was not the case a lot of times. And so that mechanism wasn't working. Political party, this one's easy. Democrats care about democracy, Republicans don't care about democracy. But support for dictatorship, I argue, is a bipartisan phenomenon, as is support for democracy, on the other hand. So if you look at some Democrats, Carter is the obvious one who makes a break from what came before in the 1970s. Bill Clinton, Obama, right? But LBJ, right, who intervenes to oppose democracy in the Dominican Republic. JFK shifts over time from early in his administration with the Alliance for Progress to later on where he's like, oh, this is a fool's errand. I'm not interested in doing this anymore. He's really worked up about British Guyana and Chetty Jagan in British Guyana, pressuring the British not to let him come to power and so forth. So, there's some big Republicans here who this argument would get right, particularly right now, but also Nixon and Kissinger, who famously, were supporting people like Yahya Khan in Pakistan. But George W. Bush, sort of Reagan, late Eisenhower. He's one who, approved and authorized these regime changes early in his administration and later, and he was giving medals to Latin American dictators. Like, it's sort of the highest civilian honor you can give to a foreign leader. You'd come and put these medals around their necks, to eventually starting to make statements about, no, we think democracy is sort of the right thing. So that also, like if you think of a sort of leader belief argument, like an Elizabeth Saunders argument, the sort of within leader change also sort of cuts against that kind of argument. That's one that's not sort of, yeah. Anyway, I thought I had to mention this one because it plays such a prominent role in many cases. There's tons of evidence out there that US officials have really negative attitudes towards some kinds of people, and that they're just not fit for A, self-governance, and B, democracy in particular. And there's all kinds of nasty statements made by people about to this effect, right? McKinley, after the US takes the Philippines, very condescending. And it's interesting, the US does take a lot of steps to, hold elections in the Philippines, but it's all under a US, 45-year sort of occupation. Henry Stimson, when he was Secretary of State, said things like this, right? Central Americans impaired by difficulties of race and climate, right? It's hot down there and people just don't think straight. I don't know what he's thinking. Unfortunately, this is not just an old-timey thing, but these attitudes persist.
That would argue against democratic practice in the United States over time.
That's right, especially in Washington, right? Everybody goes nuts in Washington in the summer. It's a good reason I don't want to go back in the summer. You still see, post-World War II presidents saying things like this. Whether it has much influence on policy, it's less clear. The problem here is that they said a lot of things like this, and they sometimes, and it did definitely influence their policies, but weirdly, for holding those attitudes, the US then would hold elections in places that it previously had declared unfit for democracy. Haiti, in my favorite case, the Dominican Republic, like Haiti, 1915 to 34, right? US officials were unequivocal that this was not a place where democracy could work. And then when, we got to get out, let's hold elections. Nicaragua, similar deal. Japan, right, is a really big one. Anyone who's read War Without Mercy knows the sort of racial overtones of World War II in the Pacific. And then, things really change on a dime. And democracy is now possible in these places. So, can't, I don't think, be the whole story here. All right. Here's the scary part for me. Okay, so I'm gonna start from a couple of assumptions. This one I'm not worried about. This one I'm a little more worried about. Whether you think this is like a Tony Smith primary goal in life, or think grand strategy, my primary interest is security. I'm gonna, adopt strategies to do that and forces and so on. And then I might have other interests as well, secondary or tertiary. You could think of it either way, but there's some kind of impetus in there to spread democracy in at least the United States. I would argue some others. Vipin.
In your version of that, is it all things being equal, democracies proceed?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just to,
obviously, because this the whole talk is about, we don't always do that, right? So the question would be like, why don't you act on those, or under what circumstances does this lead to that? Which is where I'm going right now. So liberals would say they just reject the premise, right? They're like, democracy is security, right? Because democracies don't fight each other. And so spreading democracy in the world is serving your own security, right? And we've heard this lots of times. So yes, more democracies in the system, we're better off. But as Vipin just noted, right, we know this is not the case. This can't be true because of US actions against democracies, because of US support for dictatorships. So it's not always an interest. And the question is, when is it in your interest to support democracy, whereas other times it's in your interest not to? When does it support your security or neutralize security threats? Sometimes, but not other times. And that's sort of what it all boils down to. So the ideas that I have here are kind of counterintuitive in the sense that you would think, like, why would the US want to promote democracy in powerful states? Because you have to fight big wars and pay a lot of costs to do that. And the answer is they don't just do it for fun. They do it when they get the chance to. But these are the countries that can actually pose threats. Like, and whether it's sort of where you are on the isolationism to other spectrum, you could argue about, well, how much of a threat, but US leaders perceive them as threats. So we're talking about the sort of potential hegemons in Europe and Asia over time. Wilhelmine Germany, et cetera, okay? Nowadays, China. But also places that could pose threats that are not like, these are not super powerful places, but they can have technology, right? Because nuclear weapons have really changed the game, right? It's not that they're really powerful, but they could have this capability that could pose a big threat. And Afghanistan's the tide to terrorism. So the argument is that this is where democratic peace theory kicks in. Leaders believe, they say a lot about democratic peace theory, but they believe it when they're up against states like this. And it's the classic, Michael Doyle argument we've all read, that you're all reading in grad school and we've all read before, that what you do internally in your country is what you're going to do externally. If you rely on repression at home and violence, you're going to use repression and violence abroad. And so these are states that you get, an Adolf Hitler in charge of a place like Germany is going to be a real problem. So now, normally you can't do this, right? Because who wants to fight, World War II or now World War III with nuclear weapons to democratize China or wherever, right? So there has to be some kind of opportunity, right? Getting into a war, it doesn't always have to be the reason you get into the war, but it becomes a reason and then a strong reason and then affects what you do afterwards. So we know, for example, that for Britain, democratizing Wilhelmine Germany was a war aim. And the United States, when it gets in, shares that war aim. They end up not having to do it forcefully because there's a revolution in Germany that moves in that direction. Obviously, Germany and Japan are cases that fit this bill with the unconditional surrender, and we've got to remake the regimes in these places because they could be, we've seen, right? We have good evidence that these countries can be real threats to security. So the hypothesis is that given the opportunity, this is where the United States will promote democracy. So on the flip side, weaker states, less powerful states, poorer states don't pose a threat on their own, right? So the incentive just to democratize is just weaker. But, and this is something you see a lot in the historiography, is this belief that democracy can be dangerous in some places. And this is where, John Owen's book is not just about the Cold War and the 20th century, it's about the 1500s and 1600s. It's about where, Protestantism and Catholicism are going at it. It's about monarchy versus republicanism around the French Revolution and after. And then it's communism, fascism, liberal democracy in the 20th century. one thing I haven't done yet, but want to do is look and see whether this attitude is there as well. Like Catholicism good, except under these conditions, because we definitely see that here. Why? Well, one is that these countries, given often their economic structure, where you've had, a rich elite ruling over a very large impoverished group, if that impoverished group comes to power, they're going to not share US interests. So they're going to maybe act in ways that disagree with US policy. So that's a sort of weaker incentive. But the view is that sometimes democracies are dangerous because they're vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable to subversion from the outside and can become a threat owing to their alliance or with a hostile great power. Okay, so that's sort of guilt by association in a way. And that democracy in some places, i.e. poor places for the most part, is dangerous because it's less stable. They by definition are going to have some labor movements and some land reform kind of movements, and that's why U.S. political leaders viewed them as vulnerable. And so, just as a general matter, I think the U.S. is going to be less likely to promote democracy in those kinds of countries than in the big, threatening, powerful ones. Now, but we know that there's variation, right, under the hood, right? I don't know whether this says something more about me than about the world, but you find yourself like reliving history, because I was having flashbacks to my book workshop several years ago on my regime change book, where John Mearsheimer, bless his heart, gets up at the board, diagrams my argument, and he's like, this is too complicated, right? Just say that forward-imposed regime change is bad, and then there's some exceptions, right? And I was like, yeah, but I want to explain those exceptions, right? So this is kind of the same deal, right? We know there's variation among those weaker states. So what the heck's going on there? So on the one hand, it can be what the ally is doing, what the dictator is doing. And the sort of poster child case here is Trujillo. This is right in the aftermath, 1961, of Cuba falling to Castro. And the argument was that Trujillo, not only is he doing things we don't like trying to assassinate democratic leaders in other countries like Betancourt in Venezuela, he is creating Batista-like conditions in which there could be a revolution against him that would be hostile to the United States. So let's actually try democracy to neutralize that threat, because he's creating the conditions that could lead to this. Then, of course, if the threat goes away, right? If the thing or force or outside power that is, making democracy dangerous goes away, then it's safer to promote democracy. And finally, if we expect that the weak state will have congruent interests, which is not very common, but sometimes is the case. So that's my story. Now, this should say, like, I don't know. I thought about this. This is where, I'm not going to present like all the evidence because I haven't done that work yet, right? So one thing you might be wondering is like, what the heck am I mean by support, promote, oppose, whatever, right? So the working definition is tangible military economic measures intended to support, promote, or impose a particular type of political regime in another country. So this can go both ways, right? You can help the other regime, or you can oppose it. So what kinds of things am I thinking about here? Military intervention, either for or against, Aid, military or economic aid, arms sales, things like that, or the withdrawal of that kind of aid. Electoral intervention, like getting involved like in Italy or France or Japan, and sort of or Chile, putting your thumb on the scales for one side or the other. So this would kind of, and this is again, it's kind of like reliving history. A lot of my work has done this sort of large N plus case studies. And so you could look at military interventions and say, when does the US, under what circumstances does the United States promote democracy when it intervenes, when it does regime change or regime maintenance, or when it sells, who's it selling arms to, arms transfers, and things of that nature. But the idea is to stay really close to the concept of support, promote, and then complement that with case studies. My initial thought, again, is kind of period oriented case studies. And there may be a simple argument in here trying to get out, which is polarity, right? Multipolar, bipolar, unipolar, variance in threat there, but just throwing that out there. And obviously one case I'm drawn to is Dominican Republic, explaining that over time. Are you going to do over time variation in the same country? With Germany and Japan and other great power like Korea, right? This is a failure, right? The United States, when it starts to win in Korea in 1950s, like, yes, let's go all the way and unify Korea under democratic governance. That becomes the war aim. How they're going to do that when their leader of choice is an autocrat, Syngman Rhee, was less clear, but that didn't happen because Chinese came along. And then post-Cold War variation. But obviously this is the least baked. It's not even like gone in the oven kind of yet. I've thought about it, but it's really gooey. So your thoughts on this are welcome. And that is all. Thank you so much for your patience.
Great. Thank you, Alex. One point of clarification. Tastes great, less filling for the kids born after 1990 was a Miller Lite beer ad that came out in the 1970s because it.
Not that I drank a lot of Miller Lite, but
Okay.
it's highly influential.
So Ron, and then everyone else, please raise your hands high so I can see you.
Let me propose an alternative that was first enunciated under JFK, which is that our first choice is a democracy.
Yep.
Our second choice is a dictatorship. And the third option, not really one of our choices, is a pro-communist or nowadays a pro-terrorist regime. And that unless we're very confident that we're going to get number one as opposed to number three, we will opt for number two to be safe.
Yeah. That's the title. Or does it still say that?
It still says
Yeah.
that. But
Did it change from beginning to end? I don't know.
do you agree with that? Because it seems like you're going in a different direction when you're talking.
I mean, yes and no. So that was a powerful motivation during the Cold War. But at other times, like, Dominican Republic and Haiti before World War II, the United States didn't, occupies the countries. It doesn't care about democracy. It doesn't think democracy can work in these places. In fact, when they decide to have elections, they're saying, "Oh, it's never gonna work. It's gonna revert to what it was before." But they do it, and it's not because of, there's no risk of Bolshevism, Marxism in those places.
But the Dominican Republic in 1961, that was very clear on JFK.
Yeah, I mean that's when he says this quote. So I largely agree with that. I don't think it explains everything over time, but yes.
Let's see, Caitlin.
Thank you for your talk. Like the project, it's really hopeful and interesting to see work in progress. So thank you for that. I have one short suggestion and then maybe a couple other IVs to be thinking about. The suggestion is just on the framing. I feel like you kind of didn't say one of the most maybe obvious reasons that this DV matters, which has to do with what the actual regime type is of the state when the promotion is successful or not, in that, like, if a state turns out to be a democracy, that has long-term implications for kind of how it behaves. I wasn't sure if that was part of foreign policy orientation or something different, but it seems, the US is the most powerful regime shaper or changer in the system. And so I felt like you could foot stomp a bit more the fact that, like, when it gets its way or it doesn't, that has a whole bunch of other kind of downstream consequences. Maybe that was part of what you were referring to with TPT, but I felt like that was a little buried. On other variables that might matter, I mean, I was just thinking about why the US doesn't always promote democracy in weak states. And I guess I just wonder if it's as simple as the US needs something, and if it's a state that doesn't have a lot of capacity, you need a strongman, because just democracy is not going to enable that state to generate whatever it is that you need, and that could be all kinds of things. But I wonder if that's a variable to think about. And then the other variable I was just wondering about is, does the US actually have the option to promote democracy everywhere? Is it equally easy, or obviously it's not, but I mean, there are various constraints I can think of on the US being able to promote democracy, logistical, geographic resources. There's also the fact that, like, in some cases, I think the US decides that promoting democracy might actually backfire in a particular case. Like, I know this has been one of our longstanding concerns with Iran. It's like, if we embrace, Iranian opposition, that's actually the kiss of death and bad for Iranian democracy.
Yeah.
So those are just a couple reactions.
Thank you. Just to go in backwards order, yeah. Does the US always have the option to spread democracy? Or does it view it as, it definitely views it as potentially a backlash in certain places. Like even my old colleague, Peter Fever at Duke, who you wouldn't call a sort of shrinking violet when it comes to these things, said, what you really don't want in Iran is elections, because then they'll really want nuclear weapons. And so, yes, that's part of the argument here, is that you don't necessarily want democracy in certain places for certain reasons, like the Egypt case, some of the Cold War cases.
Can I just clarify though?
Absolutely.
Like, in the Iran thing, what I'm saying is, if the US promotes democracy, then democracy will not gain strength in the country.
Oh, okay. So it won't last, or it will.
Right, like allying with the opposition weakens the opposition's legitimacy and credibility, and actually would backfire in promoting democracy and strengthen the hardliners.
Yes. What was I just reading to this effect? One of my students' dissertation prospectuses makes this argument about when or why do great power rivals take advantage of polarization or domestic unrest in their rival. And he finds generally that they don't. And one of the reasons is this backlash. So yeah, that can definitely taint. Very easy for the regime to say, these are just American puppets, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, that hasn't always restrained the US historically, which, as Lindsay O'Rourke's work shows, did 60 some odd covert leadership regime change attempts during the Cold War. So yeah, it's a factor. I don't know whether it's a limiting factor. Does the US always have the option? This was something that other people who've worked on regime change make this argument. Lindsay makes it, and Melissa Willard Foster also makes the argument that, there's not always another option. There's not always another person you can go to. And so then those are the cases where you kind of have to live with the existing regime. And my response to that has always been, well, yeah, Carlos Castillo Armas was nobody's first choice, but you can always find a guy like that. My favorite is in the Congo, Laurent Kabila, where Che Guevara met Laurent Kabila in the 1960s and said, this guy should not be leading the revolution, right? He just likes to drink and do other things. And yet Rwanda like puts him at the front. So, and then US holds elections in seemingly the most unlikely places historically. So again, I kind of think, not necessarily a limiting factor. Can you just state your second point again?
It was just the weak states point. Like,
Yeah.
is it a state capacity issue where like you need something, you got to get it done. You can't
Yeah.
trust democracy to do it.
So this is reminiscent of David Lake's new book. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It just arrived in my mailbox the day before I came here, and I was reading it on the bus. Says it's all about indirect rule, and it's about the state has something that you want, some asset in his language, and there's two groups in the state, one that's more closely aligned to you, one that's farther apart, and you put your thumb on the scale to help the one that is more closely aligned, and keep the other out so you can both, they can survive, you can get what you want. So there's definitely some of that. And then, of course, if that group is small, you have to have a dictatorship. Whereas if it's larger, you can get away with democracy. But for him, it's completely a byproduct of that. I guess the point I would make is that against what you're saying, yes, places have assets. Economic motives for intervention are actually, I don't think, very well supported historically. My favorite examples are, United Fruit in Guatemala. Everyone says, oh, United Fruit, they're getting expropriated, da, 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 da. They went to Eisenhower, convinced him to do it. Well, at the time, the US had an antitrust suit going against United Fruit. They overthrow Arbenz, put in Castillo Armas, and then they break up United Fruit in the antitrust suit. In Chile, a similar thing happens with Anaconda Copper. So I'm not sure the asset argument makes sense. I think it's more of a threat. This regime could be threatening to us. And thanks for the point on the framing. Yeah, I should make that clear.
Great. Eli.
Yeah, thanks. This is a really interesting talk. A question I've pondered in the shower many times.
It's good. It's good.
So I have an understanding, maybe a very naive understanding, which I'd be interested to know, that many of the instances of the United States installing sort of brutal right-wing anti-communist dictatorships during the Cold War was done covertly by sort of the CIA and their ilk,
Right.
And that Congress wasn't aware, the public wasn't aware, and that in many cases the president and his administration wasn't aware. And then kind of in the late 70s with the Church Commission,
right,
that practice became, widely known. And I'm wondering if you think that is, the level of knowledge that the government has is kind of an important factor.
So the rogue CIA, the rogue elephant. Oh, by the way, just in the shower point, like I often tell my, I often tell PhD students who, they're all afraid to look at cases because it might taint their ability to test later, and so they just want to deduce a theory. I'm like, nobody does that. You're sort of lying in the bathtub, like, oh, I don't know anything about this, but so this is a good place to have your thoughts and be thinking these things. It's just sort of the idea that you're going to sort of deduce something from thin air is just kind of, a bit wrongheaded. You're definitely right. A lot of the ones in the Cold War were covert, largely because of the potential cost of doing it overtly, worries about international backlash and so forth. But the rogue CIA argument has pretty much been debunked in the sense that you know, the documents have come out in a lot of these cases, and you know, it's coming from the top, right? There's an authorization for unseating Mossadegh from Eisenhower. There's the same thing for Lumumba in Congo. So there's improvisation going on the ground. Like the Iran case is famous for this because I forget if it's FDR's son or nephew, Kermit Roosevelt, who's on the ground there organizing, handing out money to people to demonstrate and, go stand in front of Mossadegh's house and have riots and so forth. And his initial plot is foiled and everyone in Washington is saying, stop, 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 but he keeps going. So sometimes that happens, but the goal has typically been approved at the highest levels. Yeah, sure.
I mean,
Oh, I don't know. That's up to you.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to usurp his authority.
I mean, you mentioned a theory about Congress's involvement being important.
Uh-huh.
If in these cases, and maybe I'm wrong in assuming this too, if Congress isn't aware with that, the executive is, but Congress isn't aware. Might that be an important consideration?
Well, as we all know nowadays, Congress doesn't matter. It's what the executive branch wants. But pre-Church Committee, there wasn't a lot of congressional involvement in these things. I'm not, I don't know. So take it with a grain of salt whether they even would tell Congress about some of these operations. But in the most case, Congress was all for it because the belief in, certain kinds of threats here or there was widely shared. And so they weren't acting as much of a constraint until later.
Great. So before we move on, final shower point.
One?
No,
Come up.
no.
Your thoughts depend on your ideological shampoo.
Yeah. I used a 2-in-1 this morning. So
Ooh.
no. Right. The
Makes it
scientific
great.
method begins with observation. Right. So this idea
One
that you
would
have to
think.
deduce things from ether without knowing anything is just like absolutely.
Yeah. No.
bonkers.
Maybe.
I'm just echoing
Yeah.
there.
Maybe a topic for lunchtime.
Yes. Let's see. Kelly Greenhill.
Thanks, Alex. Nice project. I'm gonna croak at you from the back of the room.
Maybe.
And apologies in advance because I'm recovering. Brain fog may have meant that I missed important things.
Oh, no.
I have 2 questions and 1 comment. First question follows directly on Caitlin's. I'm wondering, maybe if it's not the asset and you don't find economic explanations persuasive, if you can disregard a very particular set of economic explanations that are tied to special interests or responding to the demands of, say, the Seven Sisters in Iran or United Fruit in Guatemala. But that's different from economic interests, whereby a dimension of democracy that is separate from ideology is capitalism.
Yep.
And in a number of these places, we saw interventions in favor of dictatorship when we anticipated or in line with nationalization of assets and resources. So
Yep.
there may be a different economic argument that's worth exploring further. Question mark.
Yes.
Number 2, I'm not completely sure I understand how you're thinking about threat and what constitutes a threat.
Right.
Because in a lot of the cases where we've seen declassified documents, and in cases including the DR, where LBJ regrets having sent people in, all the documents indicate that he was quite afraid of Castro supporters and replaced into communism. Ditto in Iran, and of course Kermit moves from Iran to Guatemala and so on and so forth. So threat, according to whom and what kind of threat? Is this an objective threat to U.S. economic and military power, or perceived threat in the context of the Cold War or other ideological battles? The comment is, I'm not completely persuaded that using elections as a proxy of our commitment to democracy, because our willingness or desire to hold elections seems to me as much an indication that we're ready to leave somewhere, or we want to send some signal. In many cases, it's as much about something other than our commitment to democracy. Maybe there's a question there, you can respond to it, but that's.
No, that's an excellent point.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Kelly, for damaging your voice to to make these points. On the first one, absolutely right. The United States is supporting a particular kind of dictatorship, right? A right-wing authoritarian kind of regime that's open to capitalism, open to foreign investment, and free trade. Right? That often is part of the package in a lot of cases. And you're right about the nationalization point. Danny Ryder and Danielle Villa and a third person have an argument about nationalization and foreign imposed regime change, as that's the signal of communist subversion or what have you. It's funny that then often happens also under the regime that replaces them, but who am I to say? So yes, I still don't see it as a motive. I see it as the danger is coming from somewhere else, and then we're going to change you and then bring you into the fold in a certain set of practices. Second point about the threat according to whom, and is it objective or subjective? I think in some cases it's objective, like when you're fighting World War II. It's pretty clear who the threats are, but in many of these other cases, you're absolutely right that the documents are full of, if we let Arbenz, implement his land reform law, the whole place is going to go to pot, and then all of Central America will turn red, and dot, 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 dot. So it's subjective, and often there's expert opinion to the contrary that says, yeah, there's 500 communists on a good day in Guatemala. Like, this is not really something that we should be super exercised about, take a more relaxed view. But that view tends not to win out. So it's definitely in the eye of the beholder in a lot of those cases. Your final point on elections, yes, the the commitment to actual democracy is often highly questionable, even in advanced liberal democracies, where the United States is willing to intervene, right? It's so ironic that we were shocked, I say, that the Russians might have, done some stuff in the 2016 election, but this used to be our bread and butter in the Cold War. So, for example, the exit strategy point is a good one. I keep coming back to these cases. You're probably sick of them. Haiti and Dominican Republic, right? These are cases where they're like, we're going to get out for other reasons. Let's hold some elections. We know it's not really going to work out, but whatever. What's the other one I'm thinking about? Nicaragua, right? There we held elections, but it was written down in the Dawson agreements who was going to win and who the president would be and who the next president would be and so on. So oftentimes the kind of democracy that we're talking about is certainly not pure. This gets to the question of sincerity. Like, is this really about democracy? So some of you may know Armand Grigorian's piece in IS from a few years back, where he says, why did the US support democracy movement in Ukraine in 2014, whereas it didn't in Armenia a few years earlier? And his basic argument is because the Ukrainians were against the Russians and the Armenians weren't. So it's sort of shared, foreign policy interests, shared sort of security attitude, threat. But the rest of the article is all about showing that democracy was never really a motive for intervention, even when we said it was. And so it's ultimately not about democracy promotion. My reading of the article anyway, is because we would have been just fine with a coup by pro-Western military in Ukraine as we would have about democracy. Like, why do we care about democracy there? So while I'm quite sympathetic to this view, and there's lots of instances to support it in terms of biasing and intervening and so forth, it's not always the case. So I still think there's something there to explain. Hopefully, you will tell me differently if that's the case.
Ben Harris.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I found it both highly tasteful and intellectually filling.
Excellent.
Sort of following Kelly's remarks, I have 2 questions on your independent variable. So first, I'm really curious again about how you measure the weak versus threatening states, because I think this leads to problems both on the weak and threatening dimension. On the weak state, it seems like if a state is weak enough so that there's no incentive to democratize, how can it also then be strong enough so that democratization is dangerous?
Right.
Like, who cares if it gets subverted by a hostile great power if it's weak and irrelevant?
Yep.
On the strong side, it seems like the measure of the independent variable here is a little endogenous to the dependent variable you're seeking to explain, because you're defining threat implicitly by U.S. behavior. I think Iraq is a great example of this. Iraq is a super, super weak state in 2003, far weaker than it was in 1991. Yet the U.S. promoted democracy in 2003, but didn't promote democracy in 1991. And if the answer to that is 9/11 changed U.S. threat perception, then that leads to the question like, okay, why did we promote democratization in Iraq and not in neighboring Iran, even though Iran had a more ideologically aligned government with Islamic fundamentalists and a longer history of supporting state-sponsored terrorism? And then also on independent variable, I'm just curious because it seemed like a lot of the reason, the implication why we care about this is the current moment with Trump and America's slide into the Democratic backsliding. But it doesn't seem like individuals play a role in your theory on the independent variable side. And so I'm really curious like how your theory interacts with the fact that like Trump is now the president and like US foreign policy is like fundamentally different than it was before that fact.
Yep.
These are excellent questions for which I don't have very good answers. So bear with me. Yes, the last point about individuals. Yes, totally concede the point. Like Trump comes into office, the aircraft carrier turns. Like it turns, you can turn an aircraft kind of quickly because an F-18 fell off one the other day when the aircraft carrier turned too quickly.
Nobody believes that.
Oh, okay. It didn't happen. All right. I heard it on Wait, Don't Tell Me, where I get all of my information. So yes, it can switch back and forth. What I see, okay, messed that up. What I see sort of in the longer durée is less of that. And I see sort of leaders from different parties, and you could argue Trump's not a regular Republican, sure, but falling on both sides of the divide, promoting dictatorships and promoting democracy, and sometimes changing over the course of their administration. And if, it seems crazy now, but Trump changes his mind about stuff all the time. So who knows, right, what he's going to think a year from now, much less, a few weeks from now, much less a year from now, about democracy promotion. Like, we just don't know. I of course, find it unlikely that he would all of a sudden be converted, but whatever. On the independent variable question, yes, this is work in progress. That's why I had the word threat in there, because there's these countries that we perceive as threats, but that are not great powers. And it's typically been the threat of nuclear proliferation, acquisition by those states. You're right to point to Iran. So it's not the case that this is going to happen all the time. It's going to, you're going to take other factors into account, like the costliness. This is why the United States doesn't go after other great powers just to try and democratize them. But, it's also not going to choose randomly among the, say, countries that are, thinking about or trying to get a nuclear weapon. It's not a great answer, but I appreciate the question.
Is there any other Barry in the room?
My hearing aids are not working, so I can't even make up my own name.
Oh, no.
But you so
I want to know if you remember your name. But that could be the other explanation.
Yeah, I don't often remember my own. So I'm trying to figure out whether this theory is basically a kind of structural theory, or whether it's a structure plus ideology theory.
Yeah.
Right. So what I was less clear about in your exposition was what in these cases is the United States government's theory about how democracy is going to make it better for us, right? And to push it further, not only do I want to know what their theory is, I wonder like what you think if I suggested you do a mirror image study of the Soviet Union and when it intervenes to install communists or when it's happy with plain vanilla nationalist authoritarian thugs who themselves kill communists, right? Because it could be that, great powers respond to, power and threat issues. And from time to time, they use regime change as part of their toolkit to deal with power and threat. But all they're really after is a regime that looks like them. They don't know why. It's either narcissism or that's the kind they know how to manipulate, or they think they know something about how to act. So this is just purely a structural theory. It is about power and threat. If you're a great power, it follows you will try and install your ideology to solve problems. And that's all you're seeing here. And I'd be interested in, have you thought about, a shadow case? What about the Sovs in Czechoslovakia or the Sovs in their relations with Egypt? So you see where I'm driving at.
Yes.
What can you tell me?
And the answer is, I haven't decided.
Fair enough.
I haven't really decided because, I'm looking at my presentation and I'm thinking about, the stuff I've written and I'm reading it and I'm like, is this just structural theory? That say depends on polarity. But what makes it a little weird is, the Soviets are, and I was thinking about, say, John Owen's earlier cases, like would you ever promote republicanism when you're a monarch and vice versa? But trying to figure out the conditions under which you do promote your own versus you're fine with a different one. And is that just a function of the structure of the system in terms of the threat of another great power? For some reason you think that your own ideology / set of institutions is bad in that case, right? Because we're perceiving that democracy in certain places is not what we want. What we need is, some strong man person. And then, but then the alternative to that is, well, that explains the sort of first cut. And then there's this lower level weird variation in the weaker side among these states. And I think there's an ideological drive in there that comes out at certain times and places. And it's sort of your default, or you're like, this is what we would do with no constraints. Because I view the US interventionism in mostly the last 30 years as, we got this default thing we do, here we go, you have some elections, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. We often have instincts to not do that, right? To do a strong person, but eventually it changes to this institutional business. So it could be, structure until the constraints are removed and then the ideology comes forward. I'm not sure sort of where I'm standing on that yet.
Okay, and the second part of my question, how often does ideological content play the role in what we're doing? In other words, is there an underlying theory that says if we happen to hold that other countries don't hold, which is we believe if we can make it work in this place, then the problem is solved more
Yeah.
or less forever.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas
Yeah.
maybe other countries don't think that. Well, the Soviets, their view of a totalitarian communist regime or whatever they're going to call it was a kind of once and for all, solution.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what is it? Is there content in the democratic story when we say we're going to democratize this place to deal with the threat or to deal with its power?
Yeah. My take on this is that the underlying theory is in some cases democracy matters because democracies don't fight each other. And so these powerful authoritarian states, right, they fall back on democratic peace theory in those situations. Because like, why go to the trouble of democratizing Germany or Japan? Like, why? That's a big pain in the neck. If you don't, maybe you get, the same outcome that you had before, an aggressor, powerful state. If we can just pacify it with democracy, then it will, not be a threat. At least it may not always have the congruent interests as us, but it won't be a threat. That, of course, is much weaker in these other places where democracy, and this gets to sort of underlying economic conditions, like democracy is going to stick in some places, whereas it isn't in others. In poorer places, it's going to lead to, communist revolution. And so the conditions on the ground, I think, matter for choosing which one you're going to do, as well as the outcome later.
Here endeth
That's it.
the reflection.
I think you want to think harder about this. It's not.
You
not
think? No, I got this.
a better idea. It's just that
Yes.
it seems like you want to hang more.
This is
You
all.
want more meat on the bones of the democratic theory about why this is going to lead to a happy ending.
Yeah.
Democratic peace theory. First of all, politicians don't know democratic peace theory. They may believe things about this, right?
Yeah.
So there are things that actors are believing about how democracy is going to work in these places and why it's going to be good for us. Some primitive version of democratic peace may be one of it, but there's probably a bunch of other things there too.
Yeah.
And you want to be able to explain the whole package, right? At least capture them.
And I'm calling it democratic peace theory, but that's not. Yeah, it wasn't like they were, they'd read Kant and were like, oh yes, they're expressing the same ideas
It's
as a base motivation.
I'm urging you to go
Yes.
beyond that.
Somewhat tangentially, do you have a sense of the distribution of this phenomena before, during, and after the Cold War? Most of your cases or your examples were Cold War examples, but I don't know if that reflects
There are
the interesting ones you wanted to tell us about, or if it's this like heavily concentrated in that period.
It does, and it also, it reflects the U.S. role in the world. This is basically non-existent before 1900, which is when the United States starts to get more involved in its near abroad and then project power overseas into lots of other places. I think it's also partially a function of threat, and it starts in the near abroad, right, to keep other countries out of the Western Hemisphere. And then once we develop the actual capability to do that, rather than relying on the British Navy, that starts to kick things into gear. Yes, the cases that pop to mind I think for all of us are the Cold War cases. We continue to observe it, though. I observe it before and after. But I definitely think you're right. There's a big cluster in the Cold War. And so, part of me is like saying, well, is there anything there? Is it just a function of ideology, relative power? It's sort of easily simply explained. I hope not, or I hope there's more to it than that, but that's my sort of closet fear when I'm lying in bed at night.
After chapter.
After, see what I mean?
Sorry, I've now totally mismanaged things with my shower interventions. So I've got 4 folks left. I think I'm just going to have each of them have their say, bring it back to you for closing thoughts. You can respond to some, all, or none of what you've heard, depending on your preference and how long the questions are. So just go in order. Rich, that I have here.
Great. I have written down here whose perceptions of threat and effectiveness matter, but I'll echo it in a different way. I'm coming from quantitative studies of foreign aid, like the first thing I worked on in political science. And there's this thing called democracy aid.
Yeah.
And you would think that this would go most to the most autocratic regimes, but you'd be wrong, because there's this equilibrium where you can't give Saudi Arabia democracy aid and expect it to do anything.
Right.
But you also might not give it zero, and different actors in the US government actually believe different things about the effectiveness. Like, either this is totally neutered and is actually just for show and whatever, and we're really supporting, autocratic regimes in the Middle East, or it's actually the Trojan horse, and the Saudis are going to miscalculate, and by supporting like a few, like keeping the opposition just barely alive, we can, and there is this like complex thing. And so the research design concern I had from this is like, how are you use the word intent in your definition of measuring? And I was like, oh boy, this is really dangerous. Of like, how are you going to infer intent? Whose intent in the government matters? And I don't, anyway, I'll leave it there because of time.
Great, thank you. Maria.
Sure, I have not so much a question as a stream of comments in response to the presentation, so I think this might actually work out. So first, following on to where Caitlin started with the question of, is it possible to do this kind of democracy promotions everywhere? The sharpened puzzle sort of set up a situation of, given a choice for the United States, why would it not choose the Democratic candidate under these conditions? Which sort of answers the question of where is it possible to do? But the definition of what democracy or dictatorship promotion that was presented towards the later in the presentation doesn't actually gel very well with that way of looking at the puzzle. So I think there might be a bit of a tension there. In terms of the assumptions, is the democracy seeks to promote other democracies, is that an interest of itself? Or is that an instrumental interest for the purposes of promoting security? Because right now it's presented as you seek to promote democracy in other states as a way of getting extra security for yourself. But I wonder if the promotion of democracy can act as its own independent interest, which would introduce other motivations. In terms of this threat perception and how threat plays into it, if you only go after democratizing powerful states when you have the opportunity to, and the opportunity generally comes to you through war, doesn't the war itself neutralize the threat that you're trying to deal with? So if you're at the point where you've defeated the country that you found to be a threat, where is the additional threat coming from, such that you need to democratize the country? So I can see in the cases of Germany and Japan where you think that there's a lot of latent power backing up the threat, but I'm not sure how that translates to countries where they're seeking to get nuclear weapons or they're seeking to get terrorism. So where does the continued threat post-war would come from? And then finally, the argument that democracy is dangerous in weaker states. Why don't all of those arguments also apply to powerful states, right? Post-war society, economic desolation, maybe new to democracy as an idea. Wouldn't they also all be vulnerable, and wouldn't democracy in those countries also be dangerous? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
Violence, yeah.
Charlie.
I'm gonna hold most of my questions for lunch, but I just want to raise one which is related to post-Cold War issues. Like, would you consider NATO expansion and the requirement to become democratic and support for democracy? Would you include those as cases? And it seems like in some ways you should. And then I think it's not really clear what we were doing, because it's not clear why we're expanding NATO. But anyway, so we can go into the whole thing about that, but I would include those, I think.
Yep.
And then I'm also thinking like Taiwan is a democracy, and we often hear that's it's actually among the key reasons people say we should support it. Now, of course, we supported Taiwan when it was an autocracy, but given that plays heavily in the U.S. debate, I would think that maybe that's also a kind of support for democracy. Anyway, so I'll just put those other ones on the table because I think they might feed into some of the things that actually in various ways might give different explanations.
Great, thanks. One more, John Caverly, and then back to you, Alex.
So one of the raps on democratic peace theory, it's an empirical finding and searchable theory.
Yeah.
And there's just so much variation in what actors think democracy is and what democracy does. Not just across actors, but within actors' own brains and administration. If there's no kind of systematic idea what democracy is or what democracy does that make democracy as a category for promotion more or less interesting?
Great.
Could be both. Could be either.
That's a good one. I think it changes over time. I think early on it's elections. There's not much institution building. It's if you have elections, it's good. Later it becomes much more about institutions in addition to elections. Surprise, surprise, definitions of democracy change over time, right? The United States was always a 10 during slavery times, right? So I think it changes, and that reflects, developments here about what, we think it is and maybe how we think it works. NATO expansion being cases, yes. This kind of links up to Rich's point. I've thought a lot about this, like what counts, right, as democracy promotion support. And I personally don't want to go into the, sort of USAID, all kinds of, not that I have anything against that. I sure wish it still existed. Because then it's, then I'm really opening a huge can of worms. Do I want to, so then you have to draw the line somewhere and be explicit about it and say, look, I'm talking about military intervention or whatever. And that's sort of where you can see I'm sort of struggling. It's like, what's the universe of cases? Mariah, your points are difficult, and what kind of time we have? We're over time. So they're awesome points. I think whether democracy promotion is a fundamental interest or an instrumental interest, I think it can be both. It's often instrumental, but I do think that leaders deep down are liberals, most of them in the US, and they really believe in this stuff. It's a great question. Like, what's their theory though about why this is? Because, you have all kinds of people who argue that you don't want to promote democracy in other places because they're going to have their own people to answer to. So their interests are not going to be the same as yours. So like, why would you ever do that? And that's basically the puzzle that I'm trying to answer. So I'm gonna stop there. Quit while I'm ahead. I appreciate all of your feedback on this, really early kind of stuff.
Well, thanks so much for choosing us as your.
Thank you.